begin by considering someone who is living a worldly life, governed by sinful desires and behaviors. Not necessarily a murderer, can seem a most ordinary person, but they're totally caught up in worldly values. These were understood to be sinners. Now, the term sinner, if you're a Catholic, means one who sins. And I remember a conversation I had with an evangelical years ago, and he asked me if I was a sinner. And I said, well, of course, we all are. He says, brother, I'm not. I said, well, yes, you are. He says, no, I'm not. For him, a sinner was one whose life was governed by sin. And I said, well, in that case, I guess I'm not. I still do sin, but sin doesn't rule my life, okay? So there's a different way of talking about the term sinner. So sinners are those who live outside of Teresa's castle, those whose lives are ruled by sin. Sort of like the distinction you might make between an alcoholic and one who drinks. Not all who drink are alcoholics, but alcoholics are those whose lives are destroyed in many cases by the drink. They're very much harmed by it. They can't handle it. It controls their lives. For Teresa, if you live outside the castle, you're living a carnal, worldly life. The will is very weak and unable to resist sin. The mind is deluded, filled with self-justification. The 7 deadly sins are rooted deeply in your nature, at least in your attitudes, often in your behavior as well. Nowadays, we'd say that the false self system is governing your life, and addictions and attachments are as well, most likely. Teresa of Avila has great descriptions about this in her books. A classical text called The Theology of Christian Perfection that I'll be referring to by Antonio Royo and Jordan Oman, both Dominicans. They talk about this as well. People in this stage consider mortal sin to be of little importance and something that is readily pardoned, doesn't matter much. And so they imprudently place themselves in all kinds of occasions of sin and succumb to temptation with the greatest facility. They sometimes undertake spiritual disciplines, but they excuse themselves from it very easily as well. That's a sinner. Who do we slap this label on? Well, obviously we have to be very careful about that. Only God knows who these sinners are. But usually, at least the descriptions given of sinners through the ages, they give you enough characteristics that when you come across one, if you're not one, your spirit will somewhat recoil or experience some sort of static or conflict when you're in the presence of a person whose life is so caught up by the power of sin. Do you ever have that happen? Yeah. And you might be moved to pray for them. You might be moved to dialogue with them about something. But you can just tell it's a real disturbance in their spirit. Well, thankfully, we don't stay there. We can move into the purgative stage through a process of conversion. Conversion is the turning away from the life of sin, the commitment to God, and living in God's way. And it is an ongoing process, though it may be marked by definitive turning points. There can be dramatic turnarounds, which William James called twice-born types. It can also be a gradual, ongoing process as well. The purgative way is the way or state of those who are beginners. And the term beginner can describe even a person who is, let's say, in the purgative stage in their 50s or 60s. Beginner just means that they're beginners in the spiritual life, in that they're not very far along in resisting the ways of sin and the world. They have obtained justification and the graces of salvation, but still have their passions governed to a great deal by the temptations to sin. They struggle with temptation, in other words. They strive to exercise charity and to practice spiritual discipline, but they find that a great struggle. And God does let us struggle, and God considers it important that we struggle. This point is made. Why doesn't God take us all the way into the unitive stage, the third stage? And St. Augustine, who was mentioned earlier today, answered, he says, God created us without us, but he did not will to save us without us. He wants us to cooperate in our own salvation, that we have to grow in this relationship with God by choosing relationship with God over the life of sin again and again. In the language of 12-step spirituality, which is dealing with this, many people who are caught up in addictions are moving into the purgative stage and are starting to work the 12 steps. One of the first pieces of advice they give is you have to change playgrounds and playmates if you're going to get anywhere. And so the church is supposed to be a place where we find a different society, a different community that provides support and an atmosphere for growth. Feeding the soul the milk of Scripture and community life. The practice of virtue is also very important at this stage. God often grants strong consolations to people in this stage to convince them of its rightness, to draw them to deeper love. But just as there are consolations, there are also desolations, ups and downs with God. There's a tendency in this stage to evaluate where one is with God according to how one feels. So there's a fluctuation of the heart and actions in the purgative stage, and sometimes even a backsliding, a going back down across the line, getting caught up in the old stuff again, then coming around again. But with persistent practice, the will is strengthened, the mind is strengthened, and eventually one will enter into another door. And again, I'm sharing you the traditional understanding and wisdom here. You can see how it fits with your experience. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That door is called the night of the senses, which we'll hear about in another class from Sister Renee when she talks about the dark nights. It's a passive purgation of the spirit of one's passions, of the affective system. It's as though God says, okay, I see you're putting up the good effort. You're making the effort. You're striving to live this life. You're making good progress. Now I'm going to do some things for you that you can't do for yourself. I'm going to heal you at a level that you can't touch or reach with your own willpower and your awareness. And the night of the senses does that. It heals the psyche in a way that enables us to come to a new freedom and enter into this next stage that they call the illuminative stage, or illuminative way. Now, when I say enter into, I don't mean we jump 100% from one into the other. As we'll talk about later, you can still have your feet in the world and in the purgative way, and you can still see the light and experience the fruit of the illuminative way. The illuminative way is that of those who are in the state of progress. The formal word for them is progressives, and that's not in the current political sense, where that's a liberal political position. Progressives are those who have their passions better under control, so that they easily keep themselves from mortal sin, but who do not so easily avoid venial sins because they still take pleasure in earthly things and allow their minds to be distracted by various imaginations and their hearts with numberless desires, though not in matters that are strictly unlawful. So they get caught up in all kind of stuff that's not necessarily bad, but it doesn't particularly lead you to God either. It is called the illuminative way. Now this is very important, because in it the mind becomes more and more enlightened as to spiritual things and the practice of virtue. The mind becomes more and more capable of recognizing where God is at work in one's life. One is growing in wisdom and knowledge here. One is more steady in action, in resisting sin, in practicing virtue, but there are still fluctuations of the heart. The attitudes are being purified. One is experiencing what's called recollection. Now that's an important word. I want you to write that down. Recollection. I have it written somewhere here, I'm sure. Recollection means that the mind and will are oriented unto God. That's what recollection means. And recollection can be established through an active practice like, let's say, a good prayer period, and you leave prayer and you're really tuned into God, and you say, hot dog, I'm ready for the day. Let's go, Lord. You ever have a day like that? That's when you're in a state of recollection. Recollection, then, we would say, is active or acquired as a result of your spiritual practice. But in living the spiritual life, you can also come to what's called habitual recollection. where you're sort of habitually attuned to the ways of God through trying to live in the ways of God throughout the day. And then there's another kind called infused recollection that is the beginning of contemplative prayer. That's the illuminative way, and I suspect there's a lot of Christians who live in this way, this illuminative way. You know, they're not drawn to mortal sin. They're not going to go there. They're serious about God. They're not going back into the world. They're not interested in that. That's sort of what the illuminative way is. When you make decisions about your life, God comes into consideration. In your own self-understanding, God plays a role in your own self-understanding. God is not something that's there on a shelf to pull down every now and then. God is fundamental and important in your life, integral to who you are. How one answers the question, who am I, has something to do with God now. So that's the illuminative way. One can begin in this stage to experience contemplative experiences more and more. Times when we're just drawn to be with God in prayerful rest. And that's different for everyone. Now, if we continue with that, and especially continue with our spiritual practices and living this life faithfully, we could be drawn into, here he comes, the night of the Spirit. This is St. John of the Cross's schema, where the night of the senses is purifying the psyche, the emotions, memories, and so forth. The night of the Spirit is purifying the mind, our attitudes, the roots of our thinking. And one can experience desolations not simply of emotion, but of knowing, where we can feel like we don't know anything and haven't understood one blessed thing yet, where nothing makes sense. John of the Cross called this the spirit of dizziness. It's as though we're just not so confident in our beliefs anymore. And what is God doing then? He's calling us to a deeper level of trust. Trusting in God, and it's not that we abandon our beliefs. It's just that we don't feel that they are the means by which we're connecting with God anymore. It's going to be a deeper spirit-to-spirit connection. And God draws us then into the unitive stage. And this was called the state of the perfect. Those who are perfect, at least in terms, not that they don't make mistakes. Perfection here is not understood as not making mistakes. I've often asked the question, maybe I've done it to this class already, I don't know. It's not a trick question, it's a serious question. How many of you believe Jesus made mistakes? I don't think it's thunderstorms outside, so you can feel free to raise your hand if you think he did. Sister Reen's the only brave person in here. Jesus made mistakes. Is it a sin to make a mistake? Good heavens. We say Jesus did not sin, right? But we do not say he did not make mistakes. Come on, you don't think he ever spilled a glass of milk? I mean, cut a piece of wood the wrong way for his father, bent a nail when he was nailing it in? Of course he did all that. That's. Yeah, he forgot to go home one time. Or forgot to tell them where he was going to be.
Broke curfew.
Yeah, that must have been a serious little situation. You wonder, Scripture doesn't tell all of what got discussed in that incident, does it? But listen to the description by Jordan Oman from the Theology of Perfection about these people. The unitive way is the way of those who are in the state of the perfect. That is, those who have their minds so drawn away from all temporal things. Now, it doesn't mean they're not involved with the world. They're just not caught up in it. That they enjoy great peace, who are neither agitated by various desires nor moved by any great extent by passion, and who have their minds chiefly fixed on God and their attention turned either always or very frequently to him. It is the union with God by love and the actual experience and exercise of that love. It is called the state of perfect charity, because souls who have reached that state are ever prompt in the exercise of charity by loving God habitually and by frequent and efficacious acts of that divine virtue. It is called the unitive way because it is by love that the soul is united to God. And the more perfect the charity, the closer and more intimate is the union. Union with God is the principal study and endeavor of this state. It is of this union that St. Paul speaks when he says, "He who is joined to the Lord is one spirit." St. John of the Cross would say, from now on, there's only one thing to do, love. There's only to love. These are usually contemplatives, but they can seem like very ordinary people. To say that their lives are really governed by love rather than sin, notice what the opposite of sin is here. It's love. They're all the way on the other end of the continuum. They're not necessarily overly pious. They can seem quite ordinary, as I said, unpredictable, but very authentic. Those of you who saw the movie last night, Strike, I would suspect that woman would be a good example of someone in the unitive way. I mean, just the kind of virtue she exercised, the kind of courage and so forth. They are at peace with themselves, God, and the world. All shall be well in God's world is their attitude. Those are the three traditional stages. And if you're a spiritual director, you kind of try to get a sense of where your directee is in terms of these three traditional ways. That was certainly the case in monastic life when you were doing spiritual direction, and I still kind of have it in the back of my mind when I'm doing direction with people, although I have other ways of evaluating that in my mind as well. Questions or comments about this so far? Does this make sense? Moving from a life governed by sin to a stage where the will is needing to be exercised unto God and the emotions purified so that you can live more comfortably in the illuminative stage. You can live more habitually in a virtuous manner, a loving manner, the Spirit enlightening your mind and directing your life. And finally, the unitive stage, we would say saints and mystics, people that are good examples, they show us that this is possible. Their lives show us that. And as we know of saints and mystics, there's all kinds of people there, right? There's nothing to do with personality types, gender, race, anything like that. It has to do with their degree of surrender to God through time. It wouldn't be complete without mentioning the role of suffering here. It seems that suffering has a special role to play in helping people advance here, that suffering is the means by which our intent to God is purified and tested. And we learn that no matter what the suffering, nothing can separate us from the love of God poured out in Jesus Christ, not even the kind of suffering we're bearing. That draws us more and more. We cling to that conviction and are drawn more and more closer to God.